Hey everybody, it is your professor, your coding friend, and your reigning heavyweight champion. And today we are going to talk about a few things. So because we have a variety of topics, we have two codes that you're going to be working on. So click on this one, click on this one. It'll open up this and this. Make sure that you are logged in. Make sure that you hit remix and then go off to the side to settings, edit project details, and change the name of the video to something that makes sense to you. And we're ready to get started. So first we're going to talk about the new box model. Last time we talked about the old box model, also known as content box. So that's the default. When you set up width and height inside of your CSS, it will by default use content box. And so when you say width 200 pixels, that's the width that this inner box, the content box, is going to be. And then when you add on padding and you add on your border, however wide that outline stroke is, you're adding on to that width. And so when you're trying to determine how big all of your items are and how much space they take up and how wide your website is with all of the content into it, you start to feel a little crazy because you have to calculate, okay, I need it to be this wide, but I want it to have this border and this much padding, so that means I have to set the width to so-and-so, and it's a big pain in the butt. And so that's why I recommend using border box or the new box model. And so what that does is when you say width inside of CSS, your whole box, the border, the padding, and the content will at max be whatever you set it to be. And when you change the width of the border, your stuff will still stay that wide. It will just shrink the content box in order to fit it. So when you're setting it up, I recommend putting it in the star, the select everything, and do box-sizing : border box. You only have to specify this if you're doing border box. By default, it will do content box. So if you prefer to work the other way, you can. But if you want to change it up, box sizing, border box. So here's an example. So I've set up border box in this example for everything, and then this paragraph I have set the width to 200, and so the total width of this box now is 200, and it will subtract that 5 pixels and that 20 pixels, and the remaining amount is the width of my content, versus before where it would be the width plus the padding plus the border. It's way easier to keep track of. Your stuff won't be expanding and shrinking and pushing things to new lines. You will always know the width because that's what you set it to be. I just think it's more intuitive and it works a little easier. So let's go ahead and set it up. So I have, in my HTML, I have this as a class. And so in my CSS, I'm going to go in and give it this command, border box. So let's go and do that. And this is just for demo purposes to show you what it looks like. I'm pulling up my beginning code just so I don't have to keep going back and forth. Okay, so here I have the selector for border box to show you what it's doing. Right here, I just have these different squares that are set up as divs with background colors. Thank you. And this one, I have given the class of border box, and that's just so I know what it's doing. It's my own naming convention. All of these have the class of container. That's what these blue boxes are. Okay, so in my CSS, I'm going to select that middle box, and I'm going to say box-sizing, border-box, lots of dashes. Bloop. Okay, so you can see the difference now. So on my other content, on my other containers, I've set the width to be 400. And so I have the padding to be 20 and the border to be 2. So the width of these default boxes, the ones using content box, the content width is this 400 plus this 20 plus this 2 for the border. But here when I've set up border box, now the whole thing is 400 pixels wide, and then it subtracts a little space for the border and it subtracts a little space for the padding, and then whatever remains is for the content. Cool. This was just to show you the difference between these two. Now we're going to actually move this line to where it belongs, which is up here in the select everything. So I'm going to highlight all of this, cut, paste. So now it's applied to everything, and I'm going to delete this because I don't need it anymore. It was just for that little demo. Okay, cool beans. And so now it's applied to everything. So now they're all 400 pixels wide. Cool. So when you're working in boxes with padding and margin and content width, sometimes it's hard to keep track of why things are shifting in a certain way, why stuff is so far away when the actual unit that you used was really small, but there's like a huge gap there now. So some ways to figure out why your boxes are being weird or why your spacing is being weird is to add a border to it. So if you have content like text or a paragraph, or if you have containers like divs or sections, you can put a border around them, apply a border, and so you can see exactly how wide it is. You can do that with background color too. So instead of putting a border around it, you can give it a background color, and you see how much space it's filling up. Even if you want it in the end to be invisible, you just need it to like give yourself some padding from the edge of the page or something. It's still nice to put on a background to see where that box is that you've been setting up and then delete it after you don't need it anymore. Another thing you can do is if you're not sure which line of code is affecting what, you can delete or comment out individual lines of code, and then you can see what changes. And if it's the thing that's doing it, then you can figure out why is it affecting it the way you didn't intend for it to. So don't do this bit, I'm just going to show you. So here, if say I just wanted to set up this text so that it looked like this on the page, like I just wanted to be further down and have like this much spacing between it, I could have it like this. But say I'm not sure why it's so far from the top, I could add that background and that border in, and bloop. Now I can see the edges of this container that they're all in, and it gives me a better idea of why my text is where it is. And if I think maybe the margin is what's doing it, I could comment it out by doing /* and then ending it with */. And so now the stuff inside of that comment is not being applied anymore. And so you can see the difference. That's what that margin was doing. If you're not worried about accidentally getting rid of lots of code, you can just delete that line and Command Z and it will do the same thing. But commenting out is a way of protecting your code so it's not just like deleted in case you accidentally lose that. Okay, so let's go back. The next thing we're going to talk about is display. So I may have mentioned this to you in class if you ran into an issue. There are certain elements inside of HTML that are applied a certain type of display by default. So inline block and inline block say whether or not an element can share a line with another element or if it breaks to the next line. So if you've used two paragraphs, you know what I'm talking about, because you have one paragraph and then as soon as you start up that next paragraph element, it'll automatically push it down to the next line. The text won't run together. And so that's an example of using block. And so different types of elements will default behave in a certain way on whether or not they can share lines based on how they're usually used. But you can go in and give it a different property if you want it to work differently. So if you want to have something that is display block, or if you made something that is by default display block, it will take up as much height that is needed for the content, and then the width will fill up the entire width of whatever parent container it is in. That doesn't include like padding. So if you've used a paragraph element before and you've given it a background color, you see that it fills up that whole width like a fluid filling a container. But the height is only as tall as the descenders to the ascenders. So when you have something that is block, you can go in CSS and define the width and the height. So those ones you can say width and height to, just like we talked about with the new box model, and it will change the width and height of that element. So things that by default are block are paragraphs, headings, divs, all of those are by default block. You can change the width and the height. The width without you touching it is the full width of its container. If you want to change something that is not by default block, you just say display :block, and now you can give it a width and a height. So let's do that. So we're going to change up the strong element, and we're going to give it a width, and then we're going to change its display to block. So strong is an element that can, by default, share the same line as everything else, because the way that you use it here is that it's usually part of a sentence. So it's not meant to drop to a new line. The way that they intend for you to use it is to be in line with other words. And so it won't drop to the next line. The downside, though, is if I want, say, this background color to be longer or something, if I want to control the width and the height of this content box around strong, I can't, because it's not block, it's inline. So if I wanted to override that control, I just go into CSS, I find strong, I wrote it, you'd have to write it, it's not there by default, and I'm going to give it a width of 25 pixels. I'm just doing this to show you I've added that width in, and it's done literally nothing. It's still the same width because it is not a block type. I can change that by saying display :block. There we go. So now that I've changed it as block, it cannot share the line with the other elements, so it drops it to a new line. But now this background color that I gave it is 25 pixels wide, so I am controlling the width of that content box. Okay. Nope. So strong is an inline element, which means that it takes up only as much space as the content. So block, the width goes all the way to the edge of its container, but with inline, it's only the width of the content that it is. So if it's a word, it goes from the beginning to the end of the word. It doesn't need to go to a new line, so you can have a word and then that inline element like strong or I or B, and then another word, and they can all sit on the same line by default. The downside is that it cannot be defined by its width and its height. It will just be the size of the content that you give it. So some things by default are M, strong, I, all of those things that you would use like in a paragraph, those are all by default inline. If you have something that isn't inline that you would like to have, say, share the line with something else, you can change it manually by saying display inline. So let's go and do that. We're going to find our inline selector, give it a width, and then change the display. So in here, I have inline, and inline is applied to these three guys here. So that's these three right here. I've given a class of inline because I knew what I wanted to use them for. And so when I go into my CSS, I can say, okay, for the class inline, I'm going to change the width to 25 pixels just because I want to show you. So by default, it's blocked, so I can change the width. But now, if I change it to display inline, boop, they boop up right next to each other, but they are the width of the content. That 25 pixel thing is now overridden. We can't change the width of it because it's now inline. Okay. But what if you want things to share the line and you want to change the width and the height of them? You can. All of your dreams can come true. You just use inline dash block. Again, CSS loves a dash. So this combines the best of both worlds of inline and block. It allows things to appear in the same line. It allows you to control the width and the height. Things that are by default inline block are images. So you may have noticed when you have two images, they will show up next to each other by default, but you can still adjust their width and their height. That's because they are inline block. If there's something that you want to be inline block that isn't by default, you just say display :inline dash block. And so let's do that. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to change the width of this class to 50, and we're going to change the display to inline block. So my inline block are these three down here, these three down here, and I'm going to go to my inline block selector. I'm going to say width 50 pixels. I'm going to say display colon inline dash block. And there we go. So now I have these three things are all on the same line. They share the same line, and I was able to adjust their width. So there's extra space at the end of them. So I get the best of both worlds. Very fancy. Float allows you to push things to the left or to the right. So you're pushing an element and saying, hey, float to the left or float to the right. So if you're making something float, then you have to set the width of the container that it's going to be in because it needs to know where it's floating to. And the two values you can take are left and right. So you can tell something to float left, or you can tell something to float right, and that thing will do it. It'll do it. It'll move, it'll do the thing. So let me show you. So I have these three things. I've got a class of 2, a class of 3, and the strong class, and we're going to say float to the right. Beep. And I'm just gonna boop, boop. Nice. Okay, so down here I have my class of 2 and 3, and in my index you can see that 3 is my third one on this final block, and 2 is somewhere. Where did I put 2? Oh no. Okay, 2 is here. It's the second word in my second box. Bloop, bloop. And then I have strong up here. So we're going to make these all float to the right. So under 2, I'm going to say float right. Yeah. Boop. And there it goes. And then in 3, I'm going to say float right. Bloop. There it goes. Cool. So you can see here that my third one floated all the way to the right. And it also did the same thing with 2, even though 2 was between 1 and 3. It didn't push 3 all the way over it just because it was between these guys. It just went out of the order and just flew itself to the other side. And so I'm going to also do this with the strong element. I'm going to say float right. And there it goes. So this thing is even like a more extreme element of 2. It is not only between these things, but it's also between these words here within the same element, and it's still floated all the way over to the side. So float is a pretty cool, pretty strong way. You can also do float left if you have all of your stuff aligned right. You can say float left, and it will bounce to the other side of that box. Okay, cool. Again, it's going to the far side of its content box. So you can see here it ends at the end of this big blue box that it's going in. So that's what it's floating to the end of. And so to get it to do that, you have to specify the width of the thing that it's within, its parent. Otherwise, it's not going to do it. Okay. Pew. All right, so let's move on to the next thing, the fun second document. So position allows you to change the location of elements in your HTML document wherever you want them to go. And it's really cool and it's really powerful and it's a little bit complicated, but it's fun. And it's complicated in a fun way. So position, when you add position to an element, it'll allow you to move it top to bottom, left to right, anywhere on the page. So these are the different position values you can use. By default, things are static, but you can also use relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. And I'll talk about all of them. So first is relative. Static is the first one. You're used to static. It's how everything works so far. Relative, when you say, hey, the position of this is relative, you can move it from the top. You can specify a certain distance from the top. So you top colon and then whatever distance you want, and it will push it down from the top. You can do from the bottom. So you can say, hey, be 10 pixels from the bottom, and it will give it that space there. You can also do from the left or from the right, and it will move it relative to that. And it's moving it relative to its default position. So wherever it is on the website before you style it, it's moving it left, right, down, up from wherever its default position was. Okay. So we're going to go in and we're going to add the static position to our static rule set, and we're going to add the relative position and move it 20 pixels from the top to the box that I've called relative. So let's see how that looks. Boop. Boop. And I'm pulling up my code so I don't accidentally mess it up. Okay. So I'm going to go to my new code, make sure you've remixed it, that you're logged in, that you've changed the name. Okay. And we're going to go to our static blocks. So here I have all of these little boxes. They're just divs with backgrounds and borders on them. And I have one named for each of the things we're going to cover. And so the first one, I just gave a class of static. And in the CSS, I selected the static, I gave it a background, color, a nice little fun border, and now I'm going to say position static. And nothing happened because that's the default. It was already doing that. I didn't need to specify it. But now if I go to relative, I can say position relative, and nothing's changed because I haven't told it what to change yet, but I can say top, I believe I said 20 pixels. Boop. And now it's moved 20 pixels from where it was. So that's relative. It'll figure out where it is on the page by default, and then when you say top, bottom, left, right, it will move it whatever distance that you want. I said pixels, but you can use REM or EM, that works too. Any sort of distance, it will calculate it. Okay, so the next one is absolute. Absolute pulls it from the stack. So you can see in my code here that there is still like space, like this is still pushed below this relative in the stack, so they're still stacked on top of each other. And relative is pushed down without pushing this guy down. They're sort of overlapping at this point. But this guy is still where he would be if this guy was acting normal. Absolute doesn't do that. It pulls it from the layer stack, rearranges some things. And it moves it in relation to the parent element. So I'll show you what that looks like by doing it. The properties are the same, so you can specify how you move it from the top, from the bottom, left, right. And you can do all of your usual unit measurement units. So we're going to go in and we're going to change the absolute just so I can show you what it means by relative to the parent. So we're going to change our absolute to be absolute. I'm going to say 0, 0 just to show you where the parent is, and then we'll change these up. Okay. So for absolute, I'm going to say position absolute. Cool. Okay. So you can see the thing that was below it is now, it just like bloop, pushed back up. It is now behind this absolute. So my fixed guy is like hidden there now. And if I say top 0, what did I say? Left 0? Boop. It is moving to the top of the web page. So why is that? Because the container element is this blue thing. It's inside this blue thing, my main. So why the heck is it going to the top of my page if it's supposed to be relative to the parent element? And that's because it will be relative to the thing that was given a position element. So because my container doesn't have a position property on it, it's ignoring it and just using the whole page. But if I come into my container and I say position relative, boop, now it's recognizing that this container exists, and it's going to go to the 0, 0 or the top left corner of that container element. So if you're ever using absolute and you're like, why is it going all the way up to the top of my web page? make sure that whatever it's in, the thing that you want to contain it, has a position property inside of it. Okay, and so now I'm going to go back into my absolute, and I'm going to change this from boring 0, 0 to something actually cool, which is 250 pixels, and I'll say left 50 pixels. Boop. So now it is 250 pixels from the top of this container and 50 pixels from the left. And so I'm shoving it around, and now I can see a little bit of that box that got covered. Okay. Fixed. So fixed is really cool. So fixed is really cool. It allows you to have it stay on the same part of the page no matter where it's scrolling. So if you ever have like a fixed header at the top that goes with you as you scroll, it is using position fixed, and it looks real fly. So this is how you would use it, position/fixed, and again, it has all of that same stuff from before. So let's do it. Let's try it out. So we're going to add fixed to fixed. We're going to say top 0, 0, so just so you can see where it defaults to, and then we'll change it up. So bloop, bloop. We're going to go to fixed. We're going to say position fixed, and I'm going to say top 0 and left 0. So here it really is based off of the page itself. So your overall web page 0, 0 is going to be the top left of your whole site. It is not going to care about the parent element. It's going up to the top. Mostly because I guess I haven't really double checked this, but my intuition is because you usually would use this for like nav bars, which start at the top of your page and usually are inside of something else. So this is where it will zero out to, but let's put it somewhere a little bit cooler and just say 300 pixels. There we go. So now it's 300 pixels from the top of my website. And if I scroll, it stays there. It looks so cool. It sounds simple, but it looks real nice. Okay, and the next one is also really cool. It's sticky. So what this lets you do is you can have an element wherever on your web page, and then as you start scrolling, as soon as it gets to a certain specified distance from the top of your page, it stops scrolling. So it's sort of like fixed, but fancy. So I'll show you what that looks like. So to get it going, you just say position sticky, and then again, the same controls. So here, we're going to change it to sticky and top 50 pixels. So sticky, position, sticky, top, well actually, so so far it hasn't moved. It's still basic. But if I say, what did I say? Top 50 pixels. Okay, so it still looks like it hasn't moved. Sticky is this one, the dark one. But if I scroll, once it's 50 pixels from the top, it stops scrolling and it starts going with it. I'm not super sure what you use it for, but it's cool. You should find something to use it for. Nice. One thing to keep in mind when you're using sticky is if you give it a distance that it is already from, it will just look like it's fixed. So say if I gave it like 500. Nope, that's too far. Huh? So if I gave it something that's already the distance from, it's just going to work like fixed does. So if your thing isn't sticky, check to make sure that there's actually that distance between it and the top. Or else why? Just use fixed. Yeah, that looks cool. All right, moving on. So z-index. Aw, man. Layers, they're coming back. You thought after InDesign and Illustrator you didn't have to worry about the order of things. Nah, it's in web too. So how you make things go from the back to the front when you're layering things, because as you saw, as I'm moving things around using position, things are stacking on top of each other or getting hidden. Sometimes you want things to layer. So you can use your Z index to say, hey, come to the front, or hey, go to the back. So here, 0, when you give something a Z dash index colon, you give it a number, and 0 is the furthest back, and then the higher the number, the further up it is. And it won't apply to static. So if you have something that is, that you haven't given a position to, that it's just the default, then Z index isn't going to work for it. So if you're giving something a Z index and it's not popping to the front or it's not moving to the back, make sure that you've indicated a position, relative, fixed, absolute, whatever. Okay, so let's give something a Z index of 10 because I want it to be in the front. I gave it a high number. So I'm going to my fixed. And here you can see that it is behind the sticky. I don't want it to be. I want it to be in front. So Z dash index colon 10. Bloop. Pops up at the top. Hell yeah. All right, and that's it. I know this was kind of a long one. So in this thing, we didn't do dev tools. I got rid of it. We learned about the new box model. We talked about position. We talked about display. We talked about the Z index, floating. Don't worry about it. And next time in class, we're going to talk about display and position and make a website. It's going to be fun. I'll see you then. Goodbye.